We are glad to introduce you our next speaker. Eklöf is an associate professor in Linköping University in Sweden. She's focusing on providing a detailed understanding on the factors driving species interactions and thereby increase our knowledge about ecosystem functioning and how they respond facing different disturbance with special attention to co-extinction cascades. On behalf of all the organizers, we really appreciate you for being here, Anna, and please feel free to start your talk.
Thanks a lot. Let's see if I can start by sharing something. Thank you so much for this nice introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to this. This has been a really pleasure to listen to the talks. I think it's been an amazing variety and a lot of interesting ideas coming up here. And I'm happy to be a part of this. And before I start, I just want to say that this is a collaborative work with many people, but those who have done exactly what I'm going to present today is Georgi Barabas and Elisa Sertwil, that are two former postdocs in my lab, and Ute Jakob from Helmholtz Institute for Marine Biodiversity in Germany. So now we're actually going to turn from the terrestrial systems and going into, I think, the marine systems. I couldn't change slide themselves. Yeah, a bit nervous. So my focus is on ecological networks, as Deborah told in the presentation. And this is, of course, a very simplified and cartoonish network of the Baltic Sea. So the different species are interacting with each other. So plants and fishes, bacteria, and cutest seal you ever seen, I think.
Anna, sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see your slides. And I wonder whether you need to go into presentation mode.
Oh, let's see. Then I said the cutest seal you ever seen. And you didn't see it, so...
We can see the image now.
I did. Oh, thanks for shouting out. Okay, so I said that this was a cartoonish description of a food web. And for those who didn't see it, this is the cutest seal you ever seen that I referred to. So, but this is not really how food webs look. They look something more like this. This is also an example of a marine food web. Not as pretty, but pretty in another way. So this example is from Weddell Sea in Antarctica, and each of these nodes represent a species, and all the lines going here in this spaghetti shape is species interactions, and here feeding interactions between species. And up here we have the top consumers in the Weddell Sea, for example, the orcas or the leopard seal, and down here we have the primary producers. So this is actually one of the best described empirical food webs we have today. And as you clearly can see, it's about 500 species and 16,000 interactions described. Nevertheless, of course, this is not all that is there, but it's a really high resolution for being empirical data. So this is how an species interaction network can look. So let's go back to our cartoonish, because it was one thing in this picture that wasn't in the other. And this, what's up here, humans. So humans interact, of course, with food webs in many different kinds, in many different ways. And the activities that humans do, or the human society do, they often cause some pressures or threats to the ecosystems. And this is a description of how human activities connects to different pressures. So, for example, building offshore structures connects to disturbance of species as a form of pressure. And this is taken from the Baltic Sea Environment Proceedings 155. So I wanted to put this up just to show you the complexity of how human activities and different pressures are, that they also form a sort of network, and a quite complex network. But there are also, we're not only putting pressures on the ecosystems. The human society, as we already heard several times, of course, is highly dependent on the ecosystems and what they can deliver to us and to our society. So ecosystem services is a way to frame this. And that's products or functions that are that the human society uses in one way or the other. And as an example here, we have food, have soil formation for actually growing our food. Photosynthesis is, of course, extremely important in our food production. We have also in the marine system, the fish, and you see all different types of services. So in fact, we have threats that are targeting certain species in our ecosystems. And these species are also delivering services to the human society. And the threats can be towards a single species or towards several species. And at the same way, services can be provided by one species or by several species. But this thing in the middle is not this simple as we saw in the first pictures. It looks something like this. So we have this interaction network of species in the middle. So in this example, if we focus on this dark red species down here in this food web, this is a consumer species that eats all the light red nodes that are in the red box here. This particular species does not eat the blue ones, but are often indirectly connected to those via one of its prey. So the other lines I'm drawing here is that some threats targeting this dark red species goes to will also affect its prey species or its predators. Actually, this is the other way around. This is a consumer, and this is a resource, and those are the consumers. I'm sorry. And this species can then be the service provider. So a disturbance at one place in the network can actually cause a disturbance to ecosystem services connected to another species in the network. And this is what we want to address in this project, to see the effect of how disturbances are rippling through the network of species to affect ecosystem service delivery. So there have been two main ways to analyze disturbances, and disturbances in form of secondary extinctions in food web. And that means one species getting lost and other species getting lost as a result of the first one getting lost. That's a secondary extinction in a food web. And there have been mainly two approaches to this. One is the topological approach, where you only look at the network and see if all resources of a consumer gets lost, then the consumer goes extinct. That means that if a consumer have 25 species and 24 of them still exist, then the topological analysis say that the consumer will exist. Dynamical, which I here call dynamical. It's a bit of a sloppy language. But what I'm talking about is that when we use coupled differential equation to model the population dynamics of each and every species and how they interact with each other. This is a great approach, and you can capture much more both direct and indirect effects in these types of models. But it's extremely parameter intensive and often quite hard also to stabilize the system and do this for larger networks. So we wanted to do it in a different way. We have done it in a different way when we analyze secondary extinctions, but we had some things that we really wanted to include. And that was that all the species in a network should have an a priori risk of going extinct. So, for example, if you have a large body size that has been mentioned in earlier talks, you have a larger risk of actually going extinct for several reasons. We also wanted disturbances to be able to affect several species simultaneously. And most important, we wanted the extinction risk to model an extinction risk that grows with the number of resources a consumer loses. So to address this, we in an earlier work, it's actually back to 2013, this paper now, we constructed a Bayesian network. We describe the food webs as Bayesian networks. So a Bayesian network is a graphical description of the probabilistic relationship among a set of variables, and in this case the variables are the species. So just a quick here information of how this works. So in a Bayesian network we set up a table of conditional probabilities. And in this little toy network we have two resources A and B, and they are eaten by one consumer C. So let's look at how consumer C is affected by what's happening to A and B. First of all, in this first line here, we say that the probability of consumer C to go extinct, even if A and B are still existing, is a value pi. So this is some kind of background extinction, that even if it has all the prey there is a risk of going extinct. Then we follow up by adding more to this probability table. So we have different cases. So the probability of C going extinct if A goes extinct but B exists. The probability of C going extinct if A exists but B goes extinct. And finally, the probability of C going extinct if both resources A and B goes extinct. This is the table we set up. And here in this last version where both A and B goes extinct, then all the species will, then the probability of going extinct for C is 1. So we can look at a slightly bigger network, but we still look at C here. So if we compare the topological case with modeling a Bayesian network with a linear approximation of losing species or the effect of losing resource species. If we just go in and look at the table for C here, we see in the topological version, then the probability of going extinct is 0.2, so equal the background extinction in all cases except when both A and B are lost. If we instead then take into account all the probabilities also for A and B going extinct in the first place, then we get another table, and this is the result of our Bayesian network. So we have an increased probability for C going extinct if one of its prey is lost. And this we can model in different ways, but if we do it linearly, it's the formula here that we have the background extinction plus 1 minus the background extinctions times the number of prey of the consumer. And that will give the probability of C going extinct. We can model this using different functional forms that I showed here. So the first one is topological. So on the y-axis, we have the fraction of resources that goes extinct. And on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of extinction of the consumer. So if we look at the topological case, we have a baseline probability of pi. That is the background risk of going extinct for this consumer. And it stays on this probability until all its resources have gone lost. We can model this linearly instead, so the more resources that goes lost, the higher is the risk of going extinct for the consumer. And then we can have some different versions, like in this case, where we have a non-linear version, where the probability of going extinct increases very sharply in the beginning. So even losing just a few preys are bad for this consumer. And we can have any function here we want. We model it by using a beta function. So what we do is that we produce this table for each and every species and specify the probability of extinction given the state of the resources. So this is where we construct the Bayesian network. And then we compute the probability of extinction for a certain species and take all the other species' probabilities into account. That's when we solve the Bayesian network. So there are some pros and cons with this method. On the good side is that it doesn't require simulated extinctions with many replicates. We can solve this numerically. It takes into account all possible outcomes without the need to compute them all and test all different scenarios. And it also captures our earlier analysis has shown that it captures a majority of extinctions that are produced by considerably more complex models. On the backlog is that it cannot, in the format I present here, account for top-down effects. And also sometimes maybe we don't want to calculate the mean of all possible scenarios with something else. So let's continue. This is how we model the network. But let's go back to our threats and we have the species in the food webs and the services. I will take you through a case study we have done in the Baltic Sea. So the Baltic Sea is a threatened sea in many ways that has substantial problems and substantial threats to it. This is unpublished data so far that we have used, but we have a Baltic Sea food web data that is very complex networks that consist of about 2,500 species and 18,000 interactions in the full network describing the whole Baltic. This network is also divided into 32 sub-networks with various number of species and interactions. And the species that are described are from the very primary producers up to the top consumers. And these are the locations in the Baltic. As you can see here, I didn't print out all the 32 locations, but I just wanted to show that it spreads from really south of the Baltic up to the north. And this is interesting because, for example, it is a difference in salinity and temperature gradient that is very, very large in the Baltic. So we have a data of species interaction networks. We have threats that are actually coupled to each of these species. And we have also ecosystem services described for each species, so what ecosystem services they are delivering. And the threats of services are taken from the HELCOM reports of the Baltic Sea. So we do some different scenarios. So we check how species responds. We vary how species responds to the loss of prey. So we vary in the network here how they respond to it. We vary the severity of the threat. So how lethal the threat is for the species. And we also vary how ecosystem, how much of the providing species that has to go lost for the ecosystem service to go lost. So varying the response to how many the food web response, then we use this beta function. The severity of the threat, there we vary this pi value, so the background extinction of the baseline extinction of the species, and increase that if the species is experiencing a threat. And the last one is the ecosystem service loss and how that responds to number of providers loss. So in this picture, we have the fraction of ecosystem service providers that gets lost. And then on the y-axis, how much of the ecosystem, the probability of the ecosystem service to get lost. And we have also here we use the beta function, so we can model this in very many different ways. But we have one convex function where a lot of services or a lot of providers have to get lost before the ecosystem services disappear. We have a linear relationship, and one opposite where the ecosystem services gets lost quite quickly, even if only a few providers are lost in the network. So, to some results of this. In this figure, I show one ecosystem service, how that one is affected, and that is changes in the salinity regime. On the x-axis, we have the different, one threat, changes in the salinity regime. And on the x-axis, we have the different ecoservices that we have analyzed. And on the y-axis, we have the fraction of service that is retained, so that is kept after we have analyzed how the threat are affecting the species, and how then the species are providing, which species are providing the ecosystem services. And I just want to point out here, yes, and the different dots here. So the first one is the concave case, so that is the best case scenario where we can lose a lot of species before the service actually gets lost. And then with the linear one is the white, and the blue one is the worst scenario. So what I want to point out here is that we have a large variety in how the services are affected. But for example, here the provisioning of food is highly affected by threats to the ecosystem. And here I just want to point out that we have different threats. So this is the one we looked at first, the changes in the salinity regime. Then we have the inputs of organic matter, selective extraction of species, and seabed damage. So 4 different threats here. And the response to the ecosystem services delivery to these different threats is very different. But food provisioning is, in several of the cases, highly affected. And finally, I also want to show you that depending on which of these sub-areas we look at, there are also varieties. So the Gulf of Riga is in the middle of the Baltic Sea, but towards Estonia, of course. And Rugia lagoons are more south in the Baltic Sea. But we have different responses depending on how the network actually looks in those areas. So to summarize, and see I'm running a bit out of time here. So we can analyze the effects of extinctions in large complex food webs using Bayesian networks. What we have is a flexible framework for coupling threats and couple that in turn to ecosystem service delivery via what's happening in the species interaction networks. The food web we can also show here that the food web interactions have large effects on the level of ecosystem service and provisioning. And that the effects actually vary depending on the network structure that is here represented by the spatial location. But also that we saw this big spread between the red, white, and blue points. So the effects are highly dependent on the algorithm for modeling losses. So we want to extend this framework further, of course. And first of all, we want to refine the functions. So for example, the severity of these ecosystem service losses. How should we model that? What is the most reasonable way to model it? And that's probably different for different ecosystem services. We also want to construct a multi-layer network, so have a network of threats. This is what is exemplified here, that some threats are actually coupled to each other and can worsen each other's results. We also want to have thinking about a network of ecosystem services, and this is something that we also addressed in earlier talks, is that we have feedbacks and trade-offs in ecosystem service delivery. And finally, couple this to socio-economic networks. And this idea has been put forward also in the two earlier papers, one from 2017 by Laura D and co-authors, and one recent by Ute Jakob and co-authors, where this figure then shows how we can really make a multi-level network looking at service delivery. And by that, I want to say thank you to the co-authors. Thank also my former lab when I was with Stefano Lucina in CTime for the Bayesian Network work, and the funders, and of course you for listening to me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anna. Great talk.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It was a very nice talk. Here is Paulo speaking. It's nice to finally see you in 2D. I hope 3D someday. Yeah. We have some questions from the audience. Thanks for this nice talk. How do you consider biomasses of the species in your Bayesian approach? Could a dramatic loss in abundances without actual extinction not already cause cascading extinctions in real-world systems?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. And here we only actually used extinction to have one kind of example. But I mean, we can use this model and set some values for when is the critical abundance reached, lower in the abundance. And that's a very important question, because of course species can get functionally extinct way before they actually get totally lost. And yes, that we can include and just change the model.
I do also have a question myself that is related to the topic. Some changes promoted by species interactions, especially those driven by keystone species, foundational species, and ecosystems engineers, might be easy to characterize in a qualitative way. It's like a big qualitative shift in the system. Do you think that the Bayesian approach that you use could be adapted to, let's say, Boolean equations, and so we could use a similar framework to address qualitative shifts in the state of the networks?
Yes, I think this is me that makes a lot of sound. Anyway, yeah, I think absolutely that we could do could be done as well. I mean, this is a very flexible framework. So using this kind of functions or that could be a very nice idea actually.
That's nice. Thank you. I think that we have time for more couple questions. I'm right, Deborah, Fred? Is that okay? Do we have a more
I think we have no time, or
yeah, I think I would go on, Paulo. I would ask.
Yeah. Okay.
One last question. How do you link species to the more difficult to define subjective ecosystem servers, for example, cultural values? How do you determine the quantitative link between species presence and a service retained?
So in this case, it's qualitative links. So it doesn't say anything about the amount of the services this is providing, which is a good thing to mention as well, because that could of course be very different between different species. And yes, this is a really good question also to address, because this is a subjective measurement for now, how to link the ecosystem services to species. So what we've done is that we have used the different reports that has been in the Helcom bundle for the Baltic Sea, and used expert knowledge to connect the species to ecosystem services. But it's a very good question, and there is a lot of development to be done there. And also, as I said, how much of the species can get lost before the services does.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anna, for your talk and for answering our